The red and blue lights did not just flash. They slashed through the darkness like warning shots. Renee Dawson exhaled, slow and steady, fingers tightening on the wheel. Not fear, not panic, just calculation. She had been trained for pressure. Combat zones, emergency drills, intelligence briefings, but nothing tested her patience like moments like these. Hands visible, no sudden movements. Stay calm. Do not escalate. She knew the drill, but she also knew this. No matter how careful she played it, some men did not need a reason to push things too far. Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson had been driving for nearly 2 hours, her fingers drumming lightly against the wheel, humming along to the soft rhythm of an old jazz tune playing through the speakers. She wasn't in uniform, just a simple black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back. She didn't stand out, or so she thought. Then she saw the lights in her rearview mirror, red and blue, flashing, gaining on her fast. Her stomach clenched, not out of fear. She knew how these things went, but out of exhaustion. She signaled, changed lanes, and eased her car onto the shoulder. She put the car in park, took a slow breath, and kept both hands where they could be seen. She had navigated foreign negotiations with hostile leaders, de-escalated threats in high-risk zones, and led operations that depended on split-second decisions. But none of that mattered here. Medals, training, discipline, useless in the face of blind authority. The battlefield had changed. The opponent? A man with unchecked power. And yet, the stakes remained the same. Survival. Every breath, every movement had to be calculated. A wrong response could mean escalation. A pause too long could be seen as defiance. Compliance was not safety. It was just delay. And Renee knew this better than anyone. Men like Briggs did not need a reason to take things too far. A white patrol car stopped just behind her. The officer took his time getting out. When he finally did, he moved like a man who expected obedience. Heavy boots scuffing against asphalt, one hand resting on his belt, the other holding a flashlight that flicked on as he approached. She turned her head slightly, watching him through the side mirror. The name on his badge caught the light. Briggs. "License and registration," he said. No greeting, no explanation. His voice was flat, practiced, impatient. Renee met his eyes in the mirror, then reached slowly into the glove compartment, pulling out her documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Briggs didn't answer right away. He took the papers from her hand, holding them just out of reach as he gave her car a once-over. "Tail lights out," he said. She frowned. "That can't be right." Briggs finally looked at her. "Are you arguing with me?" A beat of silence passed. Renee could feel the shift in the air, that quiet, unspoken moment where power met resistance, and one side expected the other to cave. She'd seen it before, in briefings, on bases overseas, in training exercises meant to prepare sailors for the world outside the Navy. She knew better than to push, but she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied, her voice calm. "My taillights were checked a few weeks ago, but if there's an issue, I can get it fixed." "Step out of the car." Briggs cut her off, like he hadn't heard a word. Renee exhaled slowly. She glanced toward the traffic ahead. No witnesses. She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel once, then reached for the door handle. Briggs let the question hang between them, as if debating whether she deserved an answer. He glanced up at the empty road behind them, then at her, his smirk growing. "You like asking questions, huh?" he said. "Let me guess. You think you are smart." Renee said nothing. "See, here is the thing." Briggs took a step closer, voice dropping lower. "You are alone. No witnesses, no body cams." He tapped his badge. "Only my word against yours." She did not flinch. Briggs tilted his head. "Now, step. Outside. Office the car." Her fingers flexed once against the wheel. Then, without a word, she opened the door and stepped out. Briggs tilted his head, smirking. "Because I said so." She let that hang in the air for a second, then unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. The night air was cooler than she expected. She stepped onto the pavement, her posture relaxed but measured. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wouldn't be bullied either. Briggs took a step back, scanning her. She could feel him sizing her up, deciding how much he could get away with. "Turn around, hands on the car," he ordered. This time she hesitated. "For what reason?" Briggs took a step closer, his smirk disappearing. "Are you resisting?" Renee held her ground. "I'm asking a question." A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance? Amusement? Maybe both. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into the speaker, then louder. "Turn around." Her pulse picked up, but her expression stayed neutral. "Officer, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do." Briggs didn't like that. His jaw tensed. "You're under arrest," he snapped, reaching for her wrist. Renee moved before he could grab her, stepping back just enough to avoid his grip. "Under arrest for what?" Briggs pulled out his cuffs. "For obstructing an officer." She exhaled sharply through her nose. So that was his game. Her military training kicked in, heartbeat steady, breathing even. She knew she had two choices: comply and fight this later, or push back and risk escalation. She wasn't about to become another statistic. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned, placing her hands on the roof of her car. The metal was cool against her palms. Briggs wasted no time, yanking her arms behind her back with a sharp jerk. The metal of the cuffs bit into her wrists, tighter than necessary. He knew what he was doing. He wanted her to feel it, to make sure the pain lingered long after tonight. As he shoved her forward, she caught her reflection in the patrol car's window. Shoulders squared, chin up, but her wrists screamed against the cuffs. He leaned in close, his breath hot and reeking of arrogance. "You military types think you're tough, huh?" His grip on her arm tightened as he pushed her again. "Let's see how tough you are when you are sitting in a cell, begging for someone to believe you." She did not flinch. If there was one thing Renee had mastered in her years of service, it was never letting the enemy see her sweat. "You don't know what you're doing," she murmured, her voice smooth, measured, controlled. Briggs chuckled, yanking the cuffs tighter. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." Renee let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "That's the worst part," she said, her voice laced with disappointment. "You actually believe that." But he didn't, not even close. The hard plastic seat of the patrol car dug into her back. Renee sat still, wrists burning against the cuffs, her breath measured. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her in. Outside, Briggs strutted back to his vehicle, muttering something into his radio. She glanced at the partition separating her from the front seat. The faint reflection of her face stared back, calm, composed. But beneath that, something simmered. She had been through combat drills, high-stakes operations, and interrogations in foreign territories. But this was different. This was a man with a badge, drunk on power, convinced he was untouchable. A few minutes passed, then 5, then 10. She shifted her hands slightly, testing the cuffs. Too tight. He had done it on purpose. The driver's side door swung open, and Briggs slid in, whistling. Briggs kept one hand lazily on the wheel, the other tapping against his radio. He wanted her to squirm. He wanted her to feel helpless. "You think you are special, don't you?" He threw a glance at her through the mirror. "Military. Tough girl." Renee stayed silent. He chuckled. "That is the problem with people like you. Always think the rules do not apply." Renee finally spoke. "The law applies to everyone, Sergeant." Briggs snorted. "That is adorable." He shifted in his seat. "See, you can pretend all you want, but I know exactly how this plays out. People like me?" He gestured to himself. "We do what we want. And people like you?" He tilted his head toward her. "You learn your place." Renee leaned forward slightly. Her voice was soft, but there was iron underneath. "You are so used to winning," she said. "What happens when you finally lose?" Briggs's grip on the wheel tightened. She didn't respond. He threw the car into gear, pulling off the shoulder and back onto the road. The patrol car lurched forward, the overhead lights still flashing. She could see the reflection of the red and blue in the side mirrors, staining the road behind them. "You know," Briggs said after a moment, "most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out." Renee exhaled sharply through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Briggs drummed his fingers against the wheel, whistling a low, tuneless melody. The kind of tune people hum when they know they have already won. You know, he mused, his voice dripping with amusement. I could have let you off with a warning, but you had to be difficult. Renee met his gaze in the rearview mirror, unwavering. Difficult is just a word men like you use when a woman does not obey. Briggs let out a slow chuckle. Obey, he repeated, savoring the word. Yeah, see, that is the problem. People like you don't know when to keep quiet, and quiet keeps you safe. Renee held his stare, her voice steady. Does it? Because history says otherwise. For the first time, his fingers faltered on the wheel. Just for a second, but she saw it. That made him pause. Just for a second. His knuckles flexed around the wheel, a flicker of irritation breaking through his smug exterior. But he covered it up quick. You military? He asked, his tone suddenly shifting. She didn't answer. Yeah, I figured, he went on. You got that attitude, that above the law type. He smirked. Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh? Still, she stayed silent. Briggs clicked his tongue. Shame, he mused, shaking his head. If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this. Her jaw tightened. The audacity of it, as if his actions were somehow her fault. Morning light spilled through the narrow windows of the courthouse, casting long streaks across the polished floors. The air inside was crisp, the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones if you sat still too long. Renee stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. She wasn't in handcuffs anymore, no orange jumpsuit, no holding cell. Just a well-tailored navy blue blazer, a simple blouse, and an undeniable presence. Beside her, her attorney, Carla Whitman, flipped through a stack of papers, barely glancing up as people trickled into the courtroom. The woman was efficient, methodical, no wasted movements, no small talk. Renee liked that. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Briggs walked in. He still carried himself like he owned the room, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted. But there was a difference now, a stiffness in his step, a flicker of something in his expression that hadn't been there before. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. Renee caught his eye. He looked away. Good. The judge entered, and the room quieted. Judge Alan Kirkland, an older man with a weary expression, adjusted his glasses as he settled in. He didn't waste time. All right, he sighed, glancing over the case files. Let's get to it. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, cleared his throat. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs. A murmur rippled through the room. Briggs shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. The judge peered at him over his glasses. Sergeant Briggs, care to explain? Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. The prosecutor cut him off. Uncooperative? He turned, lifting a document from the table. Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record shows a distinguished military career. Graduate of the Naval Academy, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that, despite all this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken taillight? Briggs opened his mouth, then shut it. The silence stretched. The prosecutor continued, flipping through his papers. Additionally, an internal review of your arrest history shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district. The murmurs grew louder. Briggs's face darkened. Judge Kirkland set his file down with a sigh. Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing. Briggs sat back, crossing his arms. She resisted. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. The body cam footage says otherwise. Another ripple of noise moved through the room. Briggs looked at the judge, suddenly more defensive. I was following standard procedure. Judge Kirkland wasn't buying it. He glanced toward the bailiff. Let's play the footage. A screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. A video began to play. Renee didn't turn to watch. She had lived it. Briggs barking orders, her calm voice, the unnecessary escalation, the smug way he tightened the cuffs. The room was dead silent when the footage ended. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Sergeant Briggs, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest and you failed to report the full details in your initial statement. Briggs opened his mouth, but the judge wasn't done. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed. His gavel came down, sharp and final. And I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs's conduct. The tension in the room snapped like a pulled rubber band. Briggs looked like he had been punched in the gut. His face flushed red, hands clenched into fists at his sides. Renee simply exhaled. Slow, controlled. She never had a doubt. As she stood, collecting her things, she glanced toward Briggs one last time. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be, because this time she wasn't the one who had to fight for her reputation. Briggs was. Judge Kirkland sighed heavily, flipping through the final documents before locking his gaze on Briggs. His next words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Briggs staggered back a step. The weight of the words slammed into him like a punch to the gut. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The judge continued, voice like cold steel. This court will also be forwarding this case to the Department of Justice for further review of possible civil rights violations. A ripple of noise moved through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Briggs's face turned a deep shade of red. This is a joke. The judge's gavel slammed down. This is justice. The murmur in the room grew louder. Reporters in the back scrambled to take notes. Briggs surged to his feet, his face red with fury. Wait, this is a setup. His voice wavered, cracking under the weight of desperation. His eyes darted toward the officers in the gallery, his colleagues, men who once called him a leader. But none of them met his gaze. They were not backing him up. They never would again. He was alone. This department will not protect officers who abuse their power, the judge interrupted, voice like stone. Hand over your badge. Now. Briggs's mouth opened, but no words came out. His fingers twitched, hesitating, as if some part of him still clung to the illusion of control. But it was gone. Slowly, stiffly, he reached for the badge pinned to his uniform. It had once been a shield, a symbol of untouchable power. Now, it felt like an anchor, dragging him into the depths of disgrace. His hands trembled as he unhooked it. The polished metal gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights, a stark contrast to the darkness settling in his gut. The badge hit the table with a sharp metallic clang. It echoed louder than it should have. Final, irrevocable. A murmur rippled through the room. The reporters took notes. The officers in the gallery did not look at him. Briggs felt the weight of their judgment settle in his bones. He had wielded fear as a weapon. But today, for the first time, he was the one afraid. His face was tight, his jaw clenched. He could feel the eyes on him. Other officers, court staff, even reporters who had shown up after word of the case spread. He wasn't used to this. He was used to control, to walking into a room and commanding respect or fear. But now, the power he had taken for granted felt like it was slipping through his fingers. And then came the worst part. Sergeant Briggs! A sharp voice cut through the hallway noise. He turned. Chief Eldon Baker stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The older man had been on the force for over 30 years, a respected figure in the department. His word carried weight. Briggs straightened. Sir. Baker studied him for a moment, then, with a curt nod, motioned for Briggs to follow him into a private office. The second the door shut, the chief's tone dropped. What the hell were you thinking? Briggs exhaled sharply. I was doing my job. Your job? Baker scoffed, tossing a file onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. That's not what it looks like from here. The body cam footage, the arrest history, the fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting? Briggs's nostrils flared. What does that have to do with anything? Baker leaned forward. Everything. His voice was quiet but sharp. This wasn't some random woman. This was a high-ranking Navy officer. You think this is just going to disappear? Briggs looked away, grinding his teeth. She was disrespectful. She questioned you. Baker cut in. That's not a crime. Briggs scoffed, shaking his head. You don't get it. People like that. The chief's expression hardened. People like what? Briggs swallowed but said nothing. Baker sighed, rubbing his forehead. The DA is reviewing every single one of your cases from the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling, and you better believe this department isn't going down with you. Briggs felt his stomach twist. What does that mean? Baker leaned back, his expression unreadable. The DA is pushing for an indictment. They are going to dig into every stop, every arrest, every report you have ever filed. And when they find what I know they will, you will not just lose your badge. You will lose everything. Briggs's stomach twisted. I was doing my job. Baker's lips curled into something like pity. You were abusing your job. And now, you are going to watch as the world finally catches up to you. Briggs swallowed. His throat was dry. His hands, still trembling, curled into fists at his sides. He was not sure which burned more, the humiliation, or the slow, sinking realization that there was no coming back from this. The words hit Briggs like a punch to the gut. His face burned. This is bull. Baker held up a hand. Don't finish that sentence. His voice was ice. Pack up your desk, and if I were you, I'd get a lawyer. Briggs stood motionless. Fists clenched so hard his knuckles drained of color. The weight of the badge was gone. The illusion of power shattered. The faces around him, once filled with forced respect, now regarded him with quiet judgment. The truth settled over him like a slow, crushing tide. He was not untouchable. He never had been. He just refused to see it. Until now.